Alright, let's carry on and find yet another way to break into our target. Let's have another look at our list of favorite tools. We looked at the information gathering so far, we covered a number of tools. We looked at the vulnerability analysis. From that, we've been using Nessus and Nmap extensively. And now, let's use yet another tool. This time, I'm going to use a tool called Nikto. And this is a tool particularly for web vulnerability scanning. What that means is that it scans websites and tries to find any possible vulnerabilities in these websites. We know we can use this tool because we have detected more than one web service running on our target. And if I run the tool as is, I get an error message saying no host specified. So I need to be able to use some particular options to make the tool run correctly. And as you can see from the output, to specify a host, I have to say -host and the IP address of my target. Now here's the thing. Like I said, there are more than one web server running on this target machine. There's one on port 80, which is an Apache server, and there's another one on port 8180, which is an Apache Tomcat server. So I'm going to go with the Apache Tomcat server on port 8180. Because it's a non-standard port, I'm gonna have to specify to Nikto what port I'm targeting. If I do not do the -p option and I tell it what port to attack or what port to scan, I will end up scanning port 80 by default. So I'm going to say -p 8180 to specify what port I want to scan. Nikto starts running, and as usual, it's going to take a bit of a time, so I'm going to speed things up a little bit with the recording. And here we can start seeing certain vulnerabilities that we can possibly exploit to our advantage. So for example, these are HTTP methods that allow us to upload and delete files of the web server. If you do not know what HTTP methods are, go back to the Web Application Security Fundamentals course. It's a free course for everybody to access. But what I'm more interested in is another vulnerability that affects Tomcat servers in particular. And that's a vulnerability that can give me remote command execution. However, for that to work, I need to be able to log in first into the server. So I need valid usernames and passwords. And lucky for me, Nikto has identified that this particular server, this particular Tomcat server, uses the default username and password, which are Tomcat. Let me go and verify this manually and make sure that I can actually log into the manager interface. So I'll open my browser. I'll put the IP address :8180. Again, I have here to specify the port number that I'm connecting to, because by default, the web browser will connect to either port 80 or port 443. But because this server is on a non-standard port, I have to tell my browser what port to connect to. And this is the link to the Tomcat manager. Let me try the username and password, which are Tomcat. And I'm in. Perfect. So now I've logged in to the manager interface. So that might allow me to deface the website, to upload some content, and so on. We can do this manually ourselves, create certain packages to upload, or we can use Metasploit, which has a module that can allow us to exploit this in a much easier, faster way. So in Metasploit, I'm going to search for Tomcat. And you see here two options. The Tomcat Manager Deploy and the Tomcat Manager Upload. Either of these options work absolutely fine on our target. I'm going to go with the second one, and to tell Metasploit what exploit I want to use, I use the use command. Pretty intuitive, right? So I say use the module path. And the next step, like we've seen with the VSFTPD exploit, I need to configure the exploit. In the VSFTPD exploit, all I had to do was set the IP address of the target. Here I have a few more options that I need to configure. For one, I have to set the password that I'm going to log in with, which is Tomcat. Then I have to set the username, which I'm going to log in with. Again, this is Tomcat. Then, of course, I have to set the remote host or the IP address of my target, which is 192.168.190.145. And lastly, I have to set the remote port that I'm attacking. See here, it is by default set to 80. However, we know by now, the port that we're targeting is port 8180. Let me double check again. I'll see that all the options are set correctly. And now all I have to do is run the exploit. And here we go. Perfect. Now I have a Meterpreter shell. The Meterpreter shell is a shell that belongs to Metasploit in particular and that allows me to execute certain commands through Metasploit on the target machine, which is different than the native Linux shell of my target. So for example, if I run a command such as id, which we know will work on all Linux systems, I get an error message here saying that this is an unknown command. Why? Because Meterpreter does not recognize this command. Meterpreter is a shell on its own. It has its own commands that I can run. id is not one of them. pwd, however, is a command that I can run, which is common between Meterpreter and Linux systems. If I do who am I, that will fail to run. So how do I know what commands I can or cannot run? I use the question mark that gives me a long list of possible commands that I can use through Meterpreter. If you're finding the concept of Meterpreter confusing, don't worry too much about it. Here's how to think about it. When Metasploit exploited our target, it uploaded a certain program that allows us to interact with the target and execute some commands. This program is called the Meterpreter. And right now we're interacting with this program. We're interacting with Meterpreter that allows us to run or execute commands on the remote machine. That's the simplest way to think about it. And here is a list of these commands that we can run. So for example, guid is a particular command that runs through Meterpreter. Now, if I want to use the actual Linux shell, which is the native shell like we've seen on Kali before, I can do that by running the shell command. And you'll notice here that the prompt changes. I have now entered the native Linux shell. So now I can run commands that we've seen before on Linux. If I try guid, for example, now it will not work because I'm running directly on Linux. I'm no longer running through Meterpreter. If, however, I try who am I, you'll see that it works. If I run id, you'll see that it works. Whereas before, when I was running it through Meterpreter, it did not work. You notice the difference? So again, now after I typed the shell command, the Meterpreter program gave me access to the native Linux shell. And I can run native Linux commands. Now here's the thing. As you can see, I am not root. I am a low-privileged user called Tomcat55. Later on, we're going to see how we can use certain scripts to find vulnerabilities that allow us to escalate our privileges. I am not going to be covering privilege escalation in a lot of details because this is something we dedicate a lot of time to in more advanced courses. However, what I'd like you to understand is the principle behind this. We do not always get root access when we exploit a target. Actually, we often do not get root access. It's more often that we get in with a low-privileged user. And then part of the process of penetration testing or ethical hacking is to find a way to elevate or escalate our privileges from a low-privileged user to root or administrator. And this process is called privilege escalation. Now, as you've seen, we managed to get to where we are because we used Nikto, which is, again, a vulnerability scanner for web applications or websites. However, it's a tool used for generic websites. There are certain tools that are very specific to particular web technologies. So for example, if you have heard about WordPress, which is a content management system that allows you to create websites, upload contents to websites, and so on, there is a tool particularly to scan WordPress websites for vulnerabilities that are specific to WordPress. And this tool is called WP Scan. There are other tools that we can use to scan Drupal websites, for example, which you do not see here in this list. So once you find out what particular technology is running behind the website and what particular software is being used, it's a good idea to go and do some research and find if there are vulnerability scanners that are specific to that technology or software being used. And again, very quickly, if we go back to the vulnerability analysis section or menu, you'll see here a tool or a script called Unix privilege escalation. And this is a script that we run on compromised systems to see how we can escalate our privileges. We're going to be looking at that in another video. All right, perfect. So far, we have found multiple ways into our target through multiple vulnerabilities. The first one, we got it through an FTP service, and that was simply based on the version number of the FTP service that we detected through Nmap. The second one was something that Nessus reported back to us. After we did the vulnerability scan, we found out that there is a potential exploit that we can use to get into the system. And in both instances, in the FTP server and in the SSH server, we managed to get in as root. The third exploit that we used was web-based. We managed to get in through a website. And in this particular case, we got in as a low-privileged user. We did not get in as root. And as I said, the next step would be to escalate our privileges. However, before we talk about this, let's find yet another way to get into our target.